Glenn Osaka, it's a person that has contributed a lot to the development of our center. In fact, 3 years ago, we decided to create the International Advisory Board with the idea of receiving suggestions, comments, and ideas coming from other places. Not only to copy them, but at least to be able to transform a mentality, learning from others. At the end, mutual learning is one of the basic elements we need to use today in society. And then with Glenn, we had the opportunity to convince him to come here periodically in order to teach us how to improve our systems, how to make our activities more consolidated and closer to the market. Because at the end, when we initiated this process, that was not clear that the people had a beautiful technology, the wonderful technology here. Nothing happens because at the end, the gap between the technology and products and services was very, very large. The only possibility just to know how these kind of aspects were dealt in other places. And one of the places is Silicon Valley. And then Glenn had a very long professional career in many companies. Just to make short the bio. He was vice president in Hewlett-Packard. He was also vice president in Cisco. He was also vice president in Juniper. He is also working now on the River Meadow software as an advisor. And then now he's also launching a several startup in the area of the Silicon Valley. Then at the end, he also knows what is happening there. And then in the last 2 years, he was also explaining us how to make better innovation and easier just by combining different kinds of things. I remember the last talk here was about the innovation by combination, and then how to combine things, and then how to hit the market with better products and services, because we were able to combine things in from different places. Today, he will speak to us about the disruptive technology, and how disruptive technologies would be also the basis for creating new value, and that's better differentiation in products and services with respect to competitors. In many cases, that's also interesting in our cases, because we need also to convince our people that it is necessary to have a very advanced products and services, but well differentiated in the market with respect to others. Then, thank you very much for coming here, Glenn, and you have the floor. Okay, thanks.
Do I use that?
Okay. I think so.
Give you that. Good morning, buenos dias. So I realize I have perhaps 2 challenges to overcome in addition to talking about disruption and innovation. The first is that I'm doing this in English. My apologies, I've been coming to Spain for 4 years in these events, and so far my knowledge of Spanish has grown just a tiny bit. So luckily, all of you speak better English than I do Spanish. And the second challenge I have is to try to match Gonzalo's enthusiasm and passion. So I don't know, with my jet lag, I don't know how it's possible, but I will do my best. So Gonzalo did an excellent job of introducing me. I think the short story is that I have 37 years of Silicon Valley experience in innovation, in disruption, and in both being disrupted and in attempting to disrupt other businesses. So, perhaps this is the story of all careers in Silicon Valley these days. So it's somewhat easy for me to talk about disruption in history, because perhaps it's the way that we learn best the formula for successful creation of businesses using this process. It's much more difficult to predict exactly what is going to happen into the future, because we can always see new technologies. It's difficult, though, to predict which ones are going to become very, very important in the future. To illustrate that, I've selected just a couple of examples. Most of these names are familiar to us. I'm going to talk a little bit about the disruptive process using some historical examples, and perhaps we will be able to use some of the lessons from what has happened in the past to predict, is SpaceX, Elon Musk, and his launch of rockets going to be successful? Is Hyperloop one, his new venture that's focused around high-speed transportation, going to be successful? I am not here to predict. I'm here perhaps to provide a model that we can use to try to evaluate perhaps what the future holds for these. So for me, and I guess I'm lucky, I know that some of you are my age, many of you are much younger. I'm going to steal very aggressively from a professor at Harvard Business School. The man is named Clayton Christensen. He's a professor there. He's actually a professor of disruptive innovation. And if you have become familiar with him and his writings, fantastic. If you have not, I would encourage you to go back and pick up his original book. And it's a very interesting study of disruptive innovation using the example of disk storage media. And during the 80s and the 90s, this was a part of the information technology industry that moved very, very fast. And the process of this kind of movement was the creation of companies and the death of companies in a life cycle that was very fast. So it gave Clayton Christensen a place, like in biology, to study what happens when the life cycle moves very quickly. So for him, and I appreciated this analogy, it's like studying the fruit fly in biology because their life cycle is so short. You can actually see and observe what the impacts are of changes in the ecosystem around the fruit fly. In Clayton's case, he chose to study disk drives and what happened in the disk drive industry as you saw the changes going forward. I will finish the presentation with some annotations of the title of the book and some other things that you can read that I find particularly valuable. What Clayton, and this is his definition, a disruptive innovation is an innovation that creates a new market and a value network that eventually disrupts an existing market and value network and displaces, removes the possibility of success for the existing company. So this is not always the way disruption occurs, but I think this is probably the way that most of the disruption occurs, because there's a simple thing, is if we want to create a new business and something that leads within the market, we have to find someone who's willing to pay for our services or pay for our product. So where does that money come from? Well, we are creating an alternative place for the customer to spend their money. So you have to find somewhere that people are spending a large amount of money and simply get them to switch. So a very simple concept. So if there's no money, it's very hard to create a new market. Simple concept. So again, by his definitions, disruptive innovation requires an enabling technology, an invention of some sort. And all of us, particularly here in a university setting, we focus on the invention. We focus on the innovation or the technology that creates the possibility. And my major point in the conversation today is that technology is not enough. And this is where perhaps some of the more difficult things occur in trying to help to educate researchers and scientists on how to make the most of a new invention, is that the next two problems are actually the biggest challenges that, in my opinion and experience, defines the difference between success and failure. And those two things are an innovative business model, some new way of thinking about how you will make money into the market, and ideally the creation of a new value network, a set of partners who will make more money themselves by helping you make money. So creating that value network or ecosystem around your innovation. So really, it seems very simple. Again, easier to talk about than to do is the enabling technology, a change in business model, and the coherent value network. So this very simple ideas. I'd like to use some examples, some of which I have personal experience with, that describe successes that have occurred using this formula. And then I'll also describe some failures, some things that did not quite work that I took part in, that were attempts as well to do this kind of disruption using this formula. So inkjet printing. So I'm trying to judge the average age in the audience, and you all look very young to me, so perhaps I will be describing something that you don't remember. For those of you that are my age or perhaps older, you remember printing as occurring in a room that you had no access to. So if there was a printer on a computer, it was inside the building that housed the mainframe computer. The printers were very, very noisy. Why? Because the process and technology they used to print documents required the impact of a print device against a ink ribbon, and it would print against the piece of paper. It was basically an automated typewriter. So some of you may remember typewriters. So in the early 80s, in the research labs at Hewlett-Packard, which the place I was employed at the time, there was a research project in our labs called SQUIRT. And the idea of the research project called SQUIRT was to be able to create a semiconductor device that would allow you to spurt or squirt liquid in a very accurate way using this technology. And the device that you see on the lower right-hand corner of the slide is actually the very first printer, the first commercial product that was created as a result of the SQUIRT technology. And I remember very, very clearly, we would be speaking to customers. I was a new engineer, and customers would come to Cupertino, to California, and they wanted to hear about our latest innovation, and we would say, oh, we need to tell you about SQUIRT. Now, I will tell you that they all laughed. They thought that this idea was ridiculous. This printer that you see here was only about this big. So very, very small, only printed in black ink. Its major contribution was that it was quiet. So it has no longer had the impact that was required. It was also relatively inexpensive. And part of this was, again, the new business model that was applied by HP into this technology. And the idea was, well, let's not make money on the printer. Let's make money on the ink. So in marketing classes in the business school, they talk about this as the razor and razor blade strategy. So if you go to the store, if you still use a metal or a razor, a handheld razor, not an electric one, what happens is that you discover that they package the handle and charge you very little for it, but there's a proprietary, a unique interface to the blade. And the way that Gillette or other companies make their money is they charge you a lot for the blades and not very much for the razor. So that was the insight, the critical insight for HP in this business was to recognize that they could provide a printer to the marketplace that was very quiet, so therefore usable in the office or usable at home, and that they could price it so that it would be very inexpensive. When you looked at it competitively, it would be a fraction of the cost of the alternative printer. But what it would enable HP to do on an ongoing basis is to charge a lot of money for the ink. So this moved from purely black and white printing to color printing. There was a lot of doubters, people inside of HP that did not believe that color printing would be useful in the home. You know, why do you need to print? Why color? And the first innovation was the ability to print a Christmas card at home in color. Seems very simple, but it was, again, it was a very innovative application of color. And of course, this has moved forward into the ability to print photographs in very high resolution. And it's now a very mature business. And that business in and of itself has been disrupted. I cannot myself remember the last time I printed a photograph at home. who does that? When perhaps you do that. I do not do that. I look at it on my phone, on my computer. So this cycle of innovation has occurred. But the case for HP, and in fact, today, what's now known as the HP consumer business, HPQ, it lives on the profits of the ink. So the reason why they continue to function well as a company, as a very mature company, is because of the remains of the business model that were created in the early 80s using inkjet printing. So interesting example. I'll call this a success. A second, I think, success that is unfolding in front of us today. I know this is a very controversial topic in Spain and in Madrid. It's also controversial in other parts of the world. It's controversial in California. There's controversy everywhere. Why? Because the force of the disruption is so strong. Right? The offer that Uber makes, not only to the rider, but to the driver, is incredibly compelling. So at one level, what is Uber? Well, Uber is, it's building on the platform of the internet. It's building on the platform of mobile data networks. It's building on the platform of the smartphone. And of course, they built an app. So what did they really contribute? Right? Are they really a technology company? Did they do the kind of innovation that you would expect to see in the university here in Kite? Probably not. But the innovation, again, was in the business model, was in the recognition that there was the capacity in the vehicles owned by everyday citizens that could be used as empty capacity, that could be utilized to create a small business for a driver. And for most of us, before Uber, when we experienced the challenge of finding a taxi in anywhere but a densely populated urban area, we know that it was very difficult. I was speaking with Gonzalo on our drive here, talking about, well, what were the ways to travel around Silicon Valley, if you did not rent a car? Well, it was nearly impossible. Well, now, even though the public transportation system in Silicon Valley is relatively weak, it's quite usable when married with Uber. So they've experienced tremendous growth. It is a very, very disruptive business. They've created a substantial value creation network for the drivers. And they have now created a new platform for perhaps other applications. So maybe this is like that first ThinkJet printer. Maybe rides is just the beginning. They have many great visions about delivery, about getting meals delivered to you at home. Many different kinds of ideas of how this value network can be utilized. We will see. We will see. This is a place where, of course, regulation and politics is getting involved to attempt to protect the existing value network for transportation. But for now, we'll call this a success. So let me talk about one that's not a success, or perhaps the first attempt that was not successful. So I traveled, it turned out to be 20 hours to get here. So I wanted to bring something to read, so I just brought my iPhone. I'm very happy it's the new iPhone 7 Plus, so the type is large enough so that I can see it. And so it's actually quite productive. And this was something that, for me, as a consumer, was always a pain, because I consider myself always to be a student. So in the past, 20 years ago, when I would travel to Spain, I would want to bring 3 books with me. I would want to bring the latest novel that I was reading. I'd want to bring the latest business book that I was reading. And then I'd want to bring a 3rd book as a spare, just in case I finished one of the first 2 books. And so, my suitcase was very, very heavy. So I was visited by an innovative engineer who had a prototype, and this, you can kind of see the device on the bottom right corner. He had a prototype of what he called the e-book. And he had started a company called Softbook. This was about 1996. And this was perhaps in the peak of my international travel. So I was particularly interested in this idea that perhaps I could just carry one device and I wouldn't have to carry my 3 books on my trip any longer. So he had 5 prototypes that he developed. He wanted HP to consider licensing or buying the technology and beginning an e-book business. And I was very excited. He had loaded a novel onto the e-book, and he gave it to me to take home over the weekend. So I go home, I have this device, I'm ready to go to bed to start to read the book, and I bring this to bed. My wife looks at me and she says, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm going to read." She said, "With that?" And she proceeded to berate me for once again bringing a piece of electronics to bed with me. So, you know, I had a tendency to do these kinds of things. But I was very excited about this idea. A fantastic idea, a great innovation. The components, the screen technology and the processor technology was low cost enough for the idea of producing this device for under $500. I thought, well, this is the beginning. This is the way to go. There was a problem. The problem was that we could not envision the creation of the business model. And the reason was that we could not get access to content. And why? Is the content was controlled by the current publishers of paper books. And while the idea, you know, there was a compelling idea, and the idea was there's so much money as a publisher spent printing and creating inventory that may or may not sell, that the idea to go to a publisher was, if we do this, you'll make more money. We'll make more money. So why did this fail? Well, our idea was, well, let's go to universities first, because university textbooks are a terrible part of the publishing business. So there are not very many consumers relative to popular books. The content becomes old relatively quickly. The potential for waste in the production of inventory is high. But no matter what we did, we could not get past the fear that the publishers had of disruption. So as a result, they did not want to have any part of this experiment. So no value network was created. Now I've thought back, well, why did Amazon succeed? And I think ultimately, much later in the cycle of innovation, Amazon was able to take advantage of 2 things that we did not have. One was the componentry and the electronics. The innovation of the device itself was much less expensive than the device that was built in 1996. The other was Amazon was becoming very clearly the leading distributor of printed books through their store, their bookstore on the internet. So they had the power to drive the publishers to make a shift that we did not have. And it's a critical part of the creation of the value network that enabled them to be successful. So interesting example. This one is my example. So this is, I was the CEO of a startup company in Silicon Valley for 6 years. We created a device. So for those of you that have experience with software, particularly software in large companies, the enterprise, what you know is it's very, very complicated. And perhaps the most complex part of enterprise software is the effort that it takes to connect different pieces of software together so that that software can interact and create an integrated solution. So our belief, our thesis when we started this company was that the new standardization around a message format called XML would standardize the ties between applications in a way that had not been done before. And we could simplify integration by moving that work from the software layer to the network layer. So we created a network device in order to do this. And it worked very, very well. So as a product, it was one of the best products I've ever been associated with from the standpoint of how we were able to engineer it and construct it. So the business model was, well, let's make it a simple network purchase and not a software programmer purchase. And our problem was that, well, and this is a little bit subtle, but the buyers of software integration were programmers. The buyers of network devices are networking people. They are two different populations in the information technology world, and in many ways, they hate each other. Oh, I'll say it differently. They do not respect each other. That's probably a better way to state it. So we were selling a value proposition to people who didn't appreciate the problem. And so for someone to buy our solution, we actually had to get the programmers to talk to the networking people and agree. And this was impossible. This is impossible. Now, it turns out that this idea of this form of integration, it's happened. So since the time that we built this technology, this theme of use of information technology has been well accepted. It just took a very long time. So we had the right device at the wrong time. C'est la vie. We did, as an entrepreneur, we had a success. The success was we convinced Cisco Systems that this was all a very important initiative, that we had the critical technology to enable Cisco Systems to participate, and we were able to sell the company to Cisco. So even though we were only, we had about $10 million per year in sales, we were able to sell the company for $135 million. So it was a good success. So what's the process? So the process, and again, this is very easy to say, very difficult to do, is, well, if you have a new technology, define the minimal product. Now, this is done often in software now. When people talk about new applications, new programs, you know, the agile methodology in software development describes is get to the minimum viable product. In other words, the minimum capability that a user will find of value. This, for many, many engineers, is perhaps the most difficult thing to convince them to do, because most engineers love to build the best possible product that they can build. And what they miss is that if you go to the minimum viable product, you can get feedback very rapidly and refine your product to your market. So the idea is go to the minimum viable product. The second is pursue the market on the low end. So go to the place where the demands are the lowest and attack existing players from the bottom where they don't expect to see the kinds of competition that would be a real threat to them. And then continue to iterate, expand the product and expand the market. And this is a key, is pursue a path that the existing players find completely crazy. So, you know, if you are if you're someone that owns a taxi company and you see Uber, when it starts, you'd say, well, why didn't they build an app to call the taxi? What they're doing, it's crazy. Why would anyone do that? We have taxis. Everyone trusts taxis. Why wouldn't they do that? Well, that irrational approach led to success. My customers, when we talked to them about the Squirt project, they said, HP, you're a high technology company. Why are you working on building an integrated circuit that squirts? What could possibly be the value of this? So be a little crazy, because it will allow you to enter the market into new territory. So what are the implications of this? Well, again, easy to say, difficult to do. So implications for research and development. Well, you seek to develop enablers of broad markets. So if you want your technology to have the greatest impact from a disruptive standpoint, you have to aim for very large potential applications. This is sometimes very hard to see, but you know, it's again, as you look in history, you can see that, well, of course, you know, the internet, of course, integrated circuits, of course, semiconductor memory. These are things that that have broad application across different industries. Identify, if you take the Uber case, identify where combinations can achieve a breakthrough. This was the topic of last year's conversation here with Clayton. And look ahead to innovative business models. So sometimes if you can think about the business model in the process of development, it gives you some insight into how to form the innovative platform most effectively. The implications for companies. If you are an existing company and you have a well-established position that you enjoy for the profitable growth of your business, well, be particularly concerned about competitors who are entering from below. The greatest thing sometimes to recognize is that the simple competitor with something that's just targeting your least profitable business may be the place where you are most vulnerable and be the early warning sign that you may be disrupted. We used to say this in HP, which is compete with yourself or cannibalize your own business before someone else does. This is a difficult thing to do because there's something about timing. You don't want to do this too early. The HP that I worked in was an interesting company. It's very different than it is today. The company that I worked in operated on the basis of the business division, and we had groups or divisions that competed with each other. So we would allow that to happen because in having internal competition, it helped us to be able to disrupt ourselves before someone came to disrupt us. That concept in today's HP is largely gone. It's largely gone. But I believe it was a critical piece of the success formula that allowed the HP company to grow successfully into new markets for over 40 years. And the last thing in this, I'll apply this to the HP example. I was having a conversation earlier today before this presentation. There was a problem in HP where we got too big. And I took part in, and it was 1996 or 7, we were about $45 billion in revenue at the time. And we had grown since the formation of the company on a 19% compound annual growth rate from 1939 to about 1994, 95. A phenomenal growth record. But then came a problem. So if we wanted to grow 10% in the next year on a basis of $50 billion, it means that we had to grow $5 billion in new revenue in 1 year. That's a big number. Now, if your existing businesses are growing at 10%, then great. But if what you're trying to do is you're trying to innovate to create a new business, the idea that you can create an innovation that generates $5 billion in new revenue in a year, it's impossible. It's impossible. So we would have conversations and we would say, well, what is the next $1 billion business? That should be easier than $5 billion. And of course, that's equally a ridiculous question. Because every business that ultimately becomes a $1 billion business, I used to say, well, it starts as a $100 business. So it starts very small. So we got to a place where it became impossible for us to consider innovations that started very small because we were so concerned about creating that billion-dollar business. And I think many companies of scale start to run into this challenge, that it becomes completely crazy to innovate on a small scale. You start to think about growth through acquisition, you start to think about more mature businesses, and you lose the edge of innovation. So I wanted to before I close, to actually talk about two other things that are related, and I'll do this quickly. I know that Gonzalo, we have a time constraint. One is about innovation and disruption in the U.S. government, and I am not talking about Donald Trump. That's not what I mean. So there's, and I know that government operations around the world, you know, there are many different forms and capabilities. In the U.S. federal government, the use of information technology is terrible. It's absolutely terrible. The process used to purchase new technology, the process that's used to put into operation new information systems is terrible. And this was most clearly demonstrated in the Obama administration when we created what is now called Obamacare. It's formerly known as to give you access to health insurance in the United States. So they had the idea that they would create websites that citizens in the U.S. would use to purchase individual health care plans. And they had 3 years to put this system into operation. On the date to switch the system on, it didn't work. This was a big embarrassment. This was the signature development of the Obama administration, the promise. So the immediate thing that happened was, well, you know, what happened? Well, they had spent something like $900 million on over 25 vendors to provide these sites for the purchase of insurance. And it was just a prime example of the failure of the purchase of information systems in the U.S. government. So Obama called on then the White House Chief Technology Officer, a guy named Todd Park, and he said, Todd, I need you to fix this. So what did he do? He returned to Silicon Valley. He visited a few of his friends. He recruited about a half a dozen programmers and said, look, we're going to go fix this thing. You're not going to be paid. You're not going to be an employee of the government because it takes the government 6 months to hire anybody. We just need you to come and fix it. So they took 6 engineers, mostly from Google, and they moved into an apartment in Washington, D.C., and they fixed the system in 90 days. 90 days. And they were not employees. They had no official authority. Well, they had the authority of the president, who said, you know, the president has asked us to fix this. And this was an indicator to President Obama that there's kind of a big problem in the government. So it began a process where they created 2 organizations, one called 18F, the other called the U.S. Digital Service, to bring the process and business model of agile software development to the U.S. government. So there are now about 500 developers. They're all in the government now on anywhere from 6-month to 2-year stints of time to use a new model for the creation of systems into the government and to use this new approach to disrupt the existing processes and mindset of the use of technology within the U.S. government. So a very interesting idea. One more thing, Gonzalo, I know, so I also want to highlight the last thing and now I am talking about Donald Trump. In Silicon Valley, when Donald Trump won the presidential election, I have to say that the shock was complete. There was no one who could believe how this would happen. And this happened, you know, in many places in the United States, but in particularly in Silicon Valley. And I think this has become a wake-up call for those of us who live and work in Silicon Valley. And the wake-up call was the recognition that, well, perhaps 2 things. One is we live in a bubble. So we operate in a world that all operates in, where we think about technology, we think about disruption, we think about how these things can work to make the world a better place, of course for us to make some money, for us to lead successful lives. But the bubble is complete. So while we focus on disruption, we focus on creating a new economy, I can say for myself and for many of those that I'm closest to and those that I've worked with over time, that we have failed to understand that we have some responsibility for the disrupted. And that the win of Donald Trump from a Silicon Valley perspective is it's the whiplash. It's the reaction from the disrupted who have said, you know, enough. Because the places that won the election for Donald Trump were places where the industries have failed, that used to operate there as the major employers. So what is just beginning, and I hope continues, but is just beginning, is for companies and innovators in Silicon Valley to think about, well, how can we spread the value of this innovation to benefit the population in a more equal way across the United States, so that we don't have such a broad split between those people that benefit from the disruption and the separation from those who have been disrupted. So that's my message. Hopefully I've offered you something that is of value. I was going to talk a little bit about what's next. You all know this. So there are many lessons to be learned. But here, the book that I referred to with Clayton Christensen is called The Innovators Dilemma. It's still available on Amazon. If you've not read it and you have an interest in disruption, I encourage you to seek that out. He also has a website of his own where he talks about current cases and sort of the solution to addressing, if you're being disrupted, what to do. McKinsey & Company has produced a report that tries to predict which of the technology we see today are going to be most disruptive. Very interesting. If you're interested in what President Obama did, Fast Company, there was an article about his creation of these new entities. And the last is an article recently in the New Yorker about this idea of whiplash. So thank you for your attention.
I think this is one of the changes that can affect the future in industry, and we know very little in Spain about the Tesla model and the Tesla development. And I don't know if you can say a few.
So the question was about the Tesla revolution and the innovation that occurred. I would say that well, first of all, Elon Musk is probably the most fearless entrepreneur that I have ever met. I had the opportunity to meet him many, many years ago in his first startup. I was actually recruited to be the CEO of his first company. And what I can say is that you can see him going on a continuous learning process around the innovation that occurred. This idea of electric cars has been around for a very long time. He started in a very niche market. So he actually executed in some ways the formula that Clayton Christensen described. If you remember, he did not actually build a first automobile. He simply took an electric powertrain and put it inside an existing sports car. So he picked a niche market that people thought would be crazy. It was not going to be a big business. And he used that as a mechanism in order to be able to continue to drive the innovation to build what today is the Model S and the Model X. And then I think the other thing that he was able to do was he captured the attention of the federal government and the movement around the environment. So his ability to get government support for funding the innovation, not only for the product itself, but to take over a auto assembly plant in Fremont, California that was empty. He was able to do things at a fraction of what the cost would have been to start up in any other way. So he was very, very clever in building this. I do think that it still remains to be seen whether this company will be successful over the long run. There are many issues, and of course the price of oil is dropping. So he has some challenges ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Glenn.